My name is Ayshah Tull. I am a journalist and reporter for Channel 4 News, and I am also a proud trustee of the Ethical Journalism Network as well. Tonight, we're in for an amazing treat. We have a great panel discussion, and it's all about being independent but not free. And we have some amazing people to speak to this evening. And we have four leading journalists from Belarus, which feels as timely as ever, Myanmar, China, and Iran to talk about all of the experiences that they've had and share their experiences with each other, as well as us, the audience. And so, as I say, we're in for a massive treat. I'm going to introduce them now, and after that, I'll get them to unmute themselves as well so that we can hear what they are going to say. We have Hanna Liubakova, who's an award-winning freelance journalist and researcher from Belarus. She produces in-depth multimedia and interactive reporting with outsiders. She began her career as correspondent and presenter for Belsat, the only independent Belarusian TV channel. Hanna, welcome. I'll ask you to come off mute if you can. Hi.
Hello. Hi,
Good
everybody.
evening. Hi. And next we have Ayman Thant, who is a Burmese American journalist who has covered business, politics and conflict in Myanmar, Thailand and the United States. They won a Pulitzer Prize in 2019 as part of the Reuters team covering the Rohingya crisis and its aftermath. They have been reporting on the military coup in Myanmar from Thailand to avoid arrest. I welcome, and I'm just going to check that you are off mute, and you are. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing all right.
Good to hear. Lovely. Well, welcome to tonight's panel. And next we have Melissa Chan, who is a journalist who focuses on issues often involving China's influence beyond its borders. She's written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and many, many more. If I were to go on, we'd be at 7:30. She's written for loads of different publications. Her work has received 2 Human Rights Press Awards from Amnesty International, a citation from the Overseas Press Club, and she has been listed in Foreign Policy's Pacific Power Index, a list of 25 people shaping the future of US-China relations. Melissa, hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good, I'm really good. Pleasure to have you. And then last but by no means least, we have Rana Ramanpur, who is a reporter and presenter with the BBC World Service. I believe she just came off air, so we're so lucky to have her covering Iranian politics. She has anchored and covered many major Iranian and international stories for the network, including Iran's nuclear program, Iran's presidential elections in 2009 and its aftermath, both for BBC Persian Television and BBC World Service, and the Iranian presidential election of 2013. Rana, it's a pleasure to have you too.
Lovely to be here. Thank you very much.
Right, lovely. So we have a lot to get through, so I'm just going to kind of kick off. But I wanted to start by asking each of our panelists to make these opening remarks. And I want to start with Hanna, because I think a lot of us have watched open-mouthed at what has gone on ever since the weekend. You are probably not as shocked as all of the rest of us, but I just want to get your assessment and your take for what's going on. Hanna, starting with you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Well, I was actually shocked. Roman Protasevich is my friend, and I think that this diversion of the plane was unexpected for anyone. We knew that Lukashenko, who has been in power since 1994, can do anything to suppress the dissent inside the country, but who could have imagined that he would have gone so far, that he would basically force the plane to land in the Minsk airport in the capital so that he could detain a blogger, a 26-year-old guy whose only guilt was that he was the editor-in-chief of the most influential social media Telegram channel. So it all kind of, it's all very scary, obviously, and it continues. What happened on Sunday, this is just kind of part of the whole picture that I will perhaps going to draw tonight. So he was immediately detained when the plane landed. And I knew that he was on the plane, and well, a bunch of friends, his friends knew as well. And we could not kind of reveal this information. We didn't want to draw too much attention to the fact that he was on board. But we kind of understood why the plane has been diverted. It was so abrupt, this diversion. So yeah, and then he got immediately arrested, and then he basically disappeared. He was taken to custody. And I'm saying that this is kind of a continuing story, because most recently the video of him was released, and you could see visible marks all over his face, over his forehead. So he's bitten.
Bruises are what a lot of people were reporting, bruises on his head at the top, that when you watch the video.
Exactly, and his parents say that his nose is broken. They noticed that. So we have a blogger who is being detained, basically because of because of him spreading information about the situation. Now he is being most probably bitten, so that he kind of says, he confesses that he was plotting riots, which is quite a nonsense, because he was based in another country, basically. And it's just happening, to a 26-year-old man. But basically the last week for us in Belarus was even kind of more shocking given what happened. So last week, on Tuesday, 1 week ago, the largest media outlet in Belarus, Tutbay, was practically demolished. Its journalists were arrested. The editor-in-chief and other journalists have been still in detention, have been under arrest. Then a political prisoner died in prison. And it all happened in just 1 week. And then if we look at the bigger picture, since August, basically, it's been a real war, not only against journalists, but also against the whole population, the whole society. Since August, there have been more than 35,000 people who have been detained, and that's a lot for a country of 9.5 million. This war, this is not something new, but there have always been repressions, and there have never been press freedom, and journalists were always arrested, and they never felt safe in the country. But now we just see that anyone can be arrested, even outside the country. And
like it's getting to this new level and this new peak. And I just wonder, your journalistic colleagues and you, how are you feeling in this very moment?
Well, I think again, right? So I never felt safe. This has never been a good situation for us, right? Inside the country, or I'm currently abroad. I'm not inside Belarus. And even here, where I thought that I am safe, I'm clearly not. And Roman was also taking some precautious measures, and he knew that anything can happen to him. But he was just flying over the Belarusian airspace. Otherwise, he was he was safe, right? So we understand that anything can happen to us right now, and that that we have to kind of take care about our safety, even in the EU, even if in kind of outside Belarus. Not to mention people who are inside the country. And now it's kind of practically like the regime is trying to destroy any infrastructure, anything that is active and alive. So that's really scary. And I think what's also kind of important, what those foreigners who were on the plane felt like when the plane was diverted, when the plane was forced to land, when they were waiting, insecure, without any information of what's going on.
Absolutely terrified. Probably.
And then this is something that has been happening to the population, to Belarusians, throughout all these years, and basically, especially last months. So, so that's the situation at the moment. And at the same time, I think people are really resilient and really resourceful. So there is a lot of hope as well.
Yeah, Hanna, thank you so much for that. I'm going to pop next to just to get your kind of sense of experiences that you have being independent but not necessarily free, the title of our panel tonight.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit strange, like it almost feels like deja vu to hear Hannah speaking, because I think the authoritarians tend to learn from one another and share notes, or either that or they're not very creative. And so I think we have sort of very similar
I like that
experiences.
assessment.
But yeah, I mean, it's a sort of similar situation in Myanmar in which what we're seeing right now is not new. We're seeing an escalation of the same sort of trends that we have been seeing really for the past 5 years. I mean, longer if we look at the sort of overall repression of independent media in Myanmar since really independence, and even before that, right? Like the British colonial state was not known for its promotion of press freedom in its colonies. And so Myanmar, the country that exists, really hasn't had very many years. I mean, I think we kind of months, how many sort of like days that journalists did not feel sort of concerned for their safety. And, with the current coup, what we're seeing is, journalists not just being a population in Myanmar that are subject to constant surveillance and potential sort of legal reprisals and kind of like vigilante violence, but now the sort of formal targets of coordinated state violence, where entire news institutions have lost their licenses, and newsrooms have had to disband essentially officially in order to try and keep their people safe. So organizations like Myanmar Now were one of the first to be targeted when the military regime took over. And despite the fact that they don't officially exist, obviously they're still putting out reporting. Generally from people in exile, but not necessarily. And we're also seeing a situation in which the regime is really cracking down on people who, not even bloggers, like people who had viral Facebook posts, and putting them on these lists of people who are being labeled as like insiders of violence and unrest, and being subject to arrest, and kind of just using the situation to essentially terrorize people and try to make them too scared to move, to speak. And that's all on top of the fact that if you go to jail, you're quite likely to be beaten. People are being returned as bodies, sometimes hollow bodies, and we're not quite sure at this moment, what exactly is happening to people in the prisons and why the bodies are returning the way they are. But clearly, they're not trying to hide what they're doing. And at least part of the goal of returning desecrated bodies is a form of fear tactics against the general public, and especially against people who have the sort of either skills or platform to speak out against what's happening.
I thank you so much for that. And you're right, it's so eerie to hear parallels between the two. It's actually quite terrifying. Moving on to Melissa, I wondered just what your experiences have been with China relations.
Yeah, before I dive into that very quickly, I just want to clarify that I'm not necessarily a journalist from China. I think some people who are Chinese journalists would take issue. No, it's not your fault at all. They would take issue with that in the sense that they might not feel that I'm speaking for them and their experiences. I am Chinese American or Hong Kong American, and therefore my experiences is particular to that identity. And we can perhaps talk about how identity is weaponized also later down the line as an issue, particularly in China, but I suspect the other panelists will also nod their head and understand some of the things I'm talking about. And also, before I jump into China, I just wanted to mention the Nicaraguan journalist Maria Lily Delgado, who was a fellow of mine at the John S. Knight journalism program at Stanford from 2012 and 2013. And I mention her because she was dragged into the prosecutor's office just yesterday to face trumped up charges that the Ortega regime has essentially leveled on quite a number of journalists. And again, this is another tactic of trying to attack independent journalists and a strategy of a lot of authoritarian states. So perhaps they are not very creative after all. I kind of tweaked my remarks because of what happened in Belarus a little bit. I mean, and I think that when I think about China, I would just say that generally speaking, China is a little different from the experience in Belarus when we think about independent but not free, right? What we saw in Belarus was a physical diversion of a plane to take a journalist or a blogger, citizen journalist, however you want to describe him. With China, they don't use bludgeons like that. They're not that physical. They prefer to employ disinformation, and it's more of a psychological campaign. So their efforts to discredit journalists are conducted online, often on social media platforms that are banned in China, but available in many other places. And here we have a clear situation of authoritarian reach beyond its borders into our smartphones where we sit in democratic states. So you have a situation where journalists of whatever nationality covering China, they may be independent, but they are not entirely free from the trolling, from the attacks. In terms of my personal experience, it's not just been on online, social. I can go back and I did pull just a few notes because I was expelled from China in 2012. That was a long time ago, but the themes are exactly the same. The tactics have not changed. When I left, Chinese state media wrote an article about me and quote, according to foreign journalist sources here in Beijing, Melissa Chan holds an aggressive political stance. She has a tense relationship with the management authorities of foreign correspondents, end quote. In other words, no one gets along with me and I'm a troublemaker. I'm a difficult woman. And there's an element of misogyny here. When, when an authoritarian state can, I believe they will instrumentalize misogyny. And this has been covered by the scholar Leda Hong Fincher, who does a lot of work on feminism in China, where she argues that authoritarian states are essentially an expression of extreme patriarchy. The article goes on to say that, quote, foreign journalists in China must abide by journalistic ethics, but the bottom line is that they should not turn facts upside down. In other words, I propagate fake news.
So their journalistic ethics, but not necessarily everyone else's.
Absolutely, and the article goes on, but there are no details of what I did wrong, just assertions and to cast a shadow over my professionalism, and not just my work, but my character. There's something dodgy about her. And that is just a textbook example of what authoritarian states do. They do that in the Philippines. Maria Ressa has been they've just gone after her, right? And in the same way to cast aspersions on her professionalism and career. So many journalists around the world face this. And again, like I said, this example I've brought up is from 2012, but this year in April, state media attacked me by name again. So they just don't let go.
Wow, by name.
Yeah, by name again. And the thing is, in the subsequent years, I've not been reporting on China all the time. I've done other things, other beats, but I weighed in and look at China's impact beyond its borders, and I got on their radar. And in this particular instance, and I'll wrap up my remarks, in this particular instance, it was in the context of the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes and racism in the United States. And what they were saying is that critics of China, journalists, including me, are perpetuating that. And so there was a tinge of my being a race traitor. And I wonder again, who on this panel also might be nodding their head going, oh, I've definitely had that. And again, authoritarian states work to conflate loyalty to them and their political power with the love of the nation. And I might as well wrap up where I started in terms of my identity, right? It's a little bit more complicated because in many ways, Beijing and nationalists in China view me as a sub-Chinese, right? Not only American, and therefore a worshiper on the altar of Western values, but born into that pesky, ungrateful territory known as Hong Kong. So I'm not quite fully ethnic Chinese in the way that they deem appropriate. And so there's all these things that are wrapped up to try to devalue the work of the journalism.
Thank you, Melissa. It's a powerful kind of statement on everything that you have been through, and I'm sure we'll delve into a lot more. And last but not least, Rana, I saw her nodding along with a lot of the opening statements. I just wonder your reflections on what you've been through over the years.
Oh, Ayshah, I agree with Aya that the authoritarian regimes are not very creative. And I can say that Iran is a combination of Belarus and China. So it does everything that it was mentioned in the previous remarks. So internally, there's no free press. There are independent newspapers that are heavily censored, and the journalists there are intimidated. They are sometimes put in prison. There are so many red lines, they can hardly write about anything. Currently, Iran is getting ready for its presidential election in June, and we hear from journalists inside the country that they have been summoned by the Ministry of Intelligence, and they were told that they're not allowed to criticize the main candidate, who is currently also the head of the judiciary. He's planning to become the president, and no one is allowed to criticize him. So internally, the journalists inside are under so much pressure, and what I have been experiencing is nothing compared to what they are going through. They're so scared, even on Clubhouse, which is this new social media platform where we get to talk to them. They're all very scared. So as soon as you mention anything that would cross the red lines, they remind us of the dangers that they face day to day by just living in Iran and trying to be journalists. So then we come to journalists who are abroad, including myself and 150 journalists who work for BBC Persian service. And there are so many other Persian news channels that are based abroad. So the regime doesn't leave us alone. It does, by not being in Iran doesn't mean that we are not intimidated. And they have used so many different techniques. For instance, in my case, my parents have been interrogated. Their passports were confiscated in 2013, so they couldn't come to visit me in London. And during the investigation, my father was told that if they wanted to see me and my little girl, who was born 2 weeks earlier, they had to stop me working for the BBC. That's one example. There are other parents who have been interrogated and said that, oh, your son might accidentally get killed in London. There might be an accidental car crash in London. Don't be naive and think that your son is safe just because he's outside the country. We had some cases of arrest. So a sister was arrested and was put in solitary confinement for 11 days, during which time they were interrogating my colleague here in London on Skype, and where they were asking her to cooperate with them. And then a few years ago, they opened an investigation against all of us. We are currently being investigated on charges of conspiracy against national security. And as a result, they have put an asset freeze on everybody. And it means that those who have any assets, many of us haven't been back since we left. I personally left in 2008, but people have inherited stuff because parents are getting old, they're passing away. Yeah. And that creates a lot of family feud, to a degree that some people decided to leave the BBC because they were in this situation that they had inherited a family house together with siblings, and the other siblings couldn't sell, and because of the sanctions, they were under so much pressure in Iran and economic pressures, and they just thought, okay, I can't carry on with my job and put my brothers or sisters in economic trouble, so they left.
So it had the desired effect,
exactly.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yes, because not everybody is a hero. At the end of the day, this is meant to be a job, and at the moment that you feel that there are personal consequences and for your relatives, that's a serious situation. I faced that dilemma when my parents were under a travel ban, and I didn't know how long it was going to last. And I had just had my first child, and there were days that I was just walking and crying and thinking, is this worth it? What if I never get to see them again? What if they don't get to see their granddaughter? Because it's no longer just you. There are so many other people involved. So to cut the story short, it's just to show that the Iranian authorities, they've got these invisible hands that can reach you everywhere, just by being outside and working for the BBC, and you feel that, okay, here I have more freedom, but it doesn't mean that you have absolute freedom.
Rana, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I read briefly before a lot of the things that you'd gone through. I didn't realize kind of how much, and it's just really, it shows the personal toll that it takes on you all. To just do your job, which doesn't even, I don't even have words, to be honest. Back to Hanna again, and just talking about the challenges of covering a regime that doesn't believe in a freedom of the press, and particularly with elections, Hanna, I wanted to ask you about, and then the rest of you feel free to kind of jump in as well if there's something that you feel relevant. I just wondered, Hanna, the challenges of doing that.
Right. So I mentioned previously that, you know, there has never been press freedom, media freedom in Belarus, and throughout all this almost 27 years of Alexander Lukashenko's career as the president of Belarus, he has always attempted to show that we are not welcomed in the country. Since last year, I think what he has been showing to us journalists is that we have to either leave or, you know, get arrested, disappear behind bars, basically. So we just cannot exist. So we journalists were detained, we were jailed, our apartments were searched, our equipment was confiscated. We were prevented from doing our job in any possible way. I used to work for this media outlet called Belsat TV. It's the only independent TV channel in Belarus, though it's based in Warsaw, in Poland, not even in Belarus, it's banned there. So I was basically sitting in Warsaw and working from there. And sometimes I was able to travel to Belarus and cover the situation from inside the country, but then I had to flee, I had to leave. So it kind of kept going on like that. So I had to stay some time abroad, and then I was coming back to Belarus. In 2000, this brilliant journalist, Dmitry Zavadskii, was killed. And since then, there is this kind of understanding among us that everything, anything can happen to journalists, to people to media workers in general, right? He was a cameraman, and because the same man is in power, many of us have either left or they self-censor their work. So these also exist, right? It might not be kind of physical danger. It might have not been physical danger before August, but people kind of knew, like my colleagues knew that, you know, something like that can happen. And then, since you asked about August, so what I've been trying to show throughout all these months is that, well, firstly, it has not started in August. And moreover, it has not started in 2020. But in August, my country, my city, which is, you know, quite quiet place, became a war zone. And then it was so weird, like there was no war, there was no kind of armed conflict, but it looked like that. The police was everywhere. There were, you know, the streets were blocked. There were stun grenades. There was shooting. People were shot with rubber bullets. I was this brilliant young journalist, Hanna Liubakova, was shot with a rubber bullet in her leg, and I was at the same place where she was. So it could have happened to me or anyone else. And then, like, whenever I went to the streets in August on the election day or right after the elections, my colleagues and myself, so I always had this spare t-shirt, a toothbrush, just in case I would be detained. And it's such a weird feeling. So you don't really know when you are going, where you're going to sleep, whether you would be at home or you would be in prison. We did not have another kind of issue. We did not really have internet at all. So we were literally cut from any information. And then, this so we were literally targets for security forces. I preferred not to reveal that I was a journalist. I had this press vest, but I did not use it because, we might have been targeted even more because of that. And my colleague of mine who was shot, she had a press vest on herself, and she was shot from like few meters, basically.
Because they could, presumably, because they could see.
They wanted to
possibly.
They wanted to target her, yeah. So overall, last year, there have been 480 cases of detentions of journalists. Belarus is now the most dangerous country for journalists in the whole post-Soviet, well, firstly in Europe and then in the whole post-Soviet area. And that's not kind of this leadership kind of top rating that I'm proud of, but that's the truth. Yeah, it just continues. My friends have been jailed. This is like real war against not only journalists but also bloggers, and bloggers do not even have protection. They don't even have any kind of press accreditation. Not that press accreditation would save you a lot, but
no, probably not.
But they don't even have this. I
saw you just nodding along there, and I think you have kind of similar experiences. And I just realized all of you, well, now essentially kind of reporting on countries while not actually being in the country. That's how dangerous it is. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of things that Hannah just said, again, resonated with me. I vacated my home the first night of the coup. When the coup happened, it was early in the morning on February 1st. And, we didn't have internet. The internet was on and off all day, and like everything was chaotic. No one knew what was happening. But at that point, media houses hadn't been raided, journalists hadn't been arrested, but I worked under the assumption that they're coming for us at some point. And then, the raids did begin, sort of arrests in people's homes did begin. And yeah, I've traveled around with a toothbrush being like, who knows? Maybe I'll be sleeping at a friend's house, maybe I'll be in jail. And the same thing with the press vest, where I think in the earlier days I wore it, especially before anyone had died. It was very helpful in terms of just getting access to spaces and kind of
and getting around.
Of not being a man, it was easier to kind of get people to take me seriously and let me pass. But at a certain point, it became a liability, and it was much safer not to have any sort of identifying marker as a member of the press. Yeah, and I think also the point about bloggers too, right? Like journalists do get targeted, and I think even in sort of normal, I guess the normal chaotic times of suppression, we don't feel safe. We're often the targets of either judicial or physical harassment. But I think in a situation like this, we, at least those of us in the press who are recognized as sort of media workers, have at least the privilege of accessing, journalists and distress funds, support from governments in terms of leaving, and just these sort of privileges that allow us to, if we're lucky, if we don't end up in jail, escape and continue to do our work in a way that we don't recognize the need to do that for someone who might be seen as a random blogger.
And Rana, I was just going to ask you, when was the last time you have been to Iran?
So I left Iran in 2008 in order to join the BBC, and I've never been back.
Will you ever be able to go back?
Not unless there is a regime change. And even then, I mean, who knows? The opposition depends on the opposition, because right now the attacks that we come under on social media is on every side. So it's not just the regime supporters, is those who are frustrated, understandably frustrated with the situation, and they want to topple the regime and they can't. And what's left to do? Attack the journalists. So at this stage, it doesn't seem likely that there will be regime change, but even if there's a regime change, I personally think that sometimes the opposition can be as hostile towards journalists.
I'm going to throw in a question from to you, Rana, again from Lisa Grenfors, who's asked, she's asked to all panelists, to what extent is self-censorship a problem?
It's not in our case. But the problem, so we don't censor ourselves at the BBC, but the difficulty we have is that we need to double source everything. And when you're outside the country and you hear about a lot of the stories and people are too scared to talk to you, you really can't confirm it. So from outside, or from many who are hearing the same stories covered in other media outlets who are not as strict about their editorial guidelines at the BBC, they might think that we are not doing our jobs or there's self-censorship. That's not true. It's just because we have more serious guidelines than many other websites or blogs or Telegram groups or WhatsApp groups. We can't cover those stories because we can't verify them, and that's very difficult.
Yeah, of course, it's a very difficult. I think that's one of the key things that sometimes people forget about journalism, is that, oh, so and so was reporting this on social media, but you're like, okay, where did you get that from? Where's the source? Have you checked with someone? And there's that level that sometimes isn't as understandable. Melissa, you left China in 2012. Why was that?
I don't know. And there's a lot of context to that. I don't think my reporting helped. I did do a lot of human rights reporting, but I say that is actually exactly the tactic of authoritarian states. They sometimes purposely make it extremely vague, because then that keeps everyone guessing, including the Foreign Press Corps that is based in China, in terms of where the line is and what they can cross and cannot cross, because you ask about self-censorship. And I do think that every journalist makes their own decision when they're in China, what they want to cover. Some people have a higher tolerance. Some people have a higher tolerance because of the passport they hold. There is a hierarchy, right? A perceived hierarchy, whether that's true or not. But some people feel like their government won't advocate and push back on China if something happened as much as a national of another government. And
what's
of course,
the perceived hierarchy?
That's really tough. I mean, it's changed a lot, right? Because I think these days, if you're an American journalist in China, I don't think you're in a really good spot, especially since you've looked at the bilateral relations and where it's gone, and how quite a number of American journalists have since been expelled. In 2012, when I left, I was the first one in more than a decade of any nationality. And since then, we've lost count the number of foreign journalists that China has expelled. And I want to also address the self-censorship from the point of view of Chinese nationals, right? Because I feel like we're ignoring that. And I do want to be careful about not speaking for them. But there are, China is both authoritarian and yet very integrated into the world economy in a way that Myanmar might not be. And what you see is that there are a lot of Chinese who go abroad and study and end up staying overseas, including journalists who work for independent news organizations or foreign news organizations, be it Reuters or AP or the New York Times, that is not state media, right? And I would say that my own observation is that there's a tendency for them to choose to cover news that might not hit third rail topics like Taiwan or Xinjiang. There are certainly examples of Chinese nationals who do, but I think part of that is perhaps because they have family back home, right? Not everyone can be a hero, but sometimes you want to be a hero to a certain extent, but you can't force your family back home to be heroes. And so I think people are very careful, perhaps some of the time, because they don't want to impact their family adversely back home. And I think the best way to sort of see that is if you start following a lot of Chinese journalists on social media, I do think you'll start noticing that they avoid certain topics, some of them. Again, these are generalizations. I want to be very careful, but it's not because they don't care about it necessarily. It might just be a choice that they feel like they have to make.
Yeah. Melissa, I'm just going to ask you another quick question that we've had in the box. I'm not going to get to any of my questions, it seems, but that's absolutely fine. It's from Amy Selwyn, and she's asked, the United States has now fallen to 41 on the Press Freedom Index. What do you think this means, if anything, to the state of journalism on a global level?
I think, and this is something that I struggled with even back in 2012 and in my years in China, right? One of the best tools you have as a journalist in an authoritarian state is if your home country commits to the values of democracy and freedom of the press. And so when you have situations in the United States where journalists are being attacked, then you can easily fall into a situation where a Chinese official will play whataboutism with you. And to a certain extent, they're right in terms of the hypocrisy. And it does really make it much more difficult for you to say, well, I should be reporting on this, and this is a value. And especially with the US-China thing, I talked a little bit about how people would think it's like a Western value to report and to have freedom of the press. I do think that's a very dangerous framework. Whenever you talk about Western values, that is a win for authoritarian states, because they essentially push out the concept of universal values. And I really do believe that freedom of the press is not a value of a certain history or certain culture or group of nations. And so I do think it's very hard if you see that kind of slip in the United States. As an American journalist, tend to go other places, not just to China, and report and lay a critical eye on what's happening in that particular country, for sure.
Definitely. Thanks, Melissa. And to Rana, I just wanted to ask another question, which is, how do you avoid being perceived as the opposition when you are kind of reporting on these things, being critical, and being used as a weapon by the opposition almost? I just wonder how you kind of go about doing that. And it's with the BBC, it's probably easier, but I just wondered your
I think
thoughts.
it's a fair question. Well, right now we're accused by all sides of taking the other side's part.
We get that at Channel 4 News as well. It's like, oh great, we're getting it from both sides. That means I'm doing my job.
Exactly. But it's not always easy, especially because people inside the country are too afraid of talking to us. Even some of them are even afraid of talking off the record. So it's very difficult to get any politicians, or there are very few regime supporters who are happy to appear on the BBC. And it's very difficult because then we have to become devil's advocate and challenge the guests who could represent the opposition, and then we immediately come under attack as being regime apologists, and then we have to continuously explain to them that no, I'm not a regime apologist, but it's my job in the absence of a regime supporter or a regime politician. I have to just express their views, and the same is true on the other side. But obviously we are trying to cover things that are not covered by the state media inside the country, and from outside, maybe a regime supporter, when they watch, they see that, oh, the majority of their bulletins are about, let's say, these protests that you don't hear anything about on state media, and to those regime supporters we might look like a channel that is supporting the opposition. But we can't care about that. We are there to cover the stories that matter to people and are not being covered by state media. And at some point, we try to balance that and give voice to every side of the story. But if one side of the story has less voice on state media, obviously it will have more of a space on our channel.
And Hanna, how is Belarusian state media processing what's going on at the moment?
Right. So, so when the plane was diverted, the first basically headline that appeared on this pro-government channel stated that Belarus saved Europe. That they called Lukashenko dictator. So they were kind of well, the dictator Lukashenko saved Europe because there were allegations of a bomb on the plane. So they tried to present it in a way that basically, you know, the authorities, the regime kind of helped the plane land safely in Minsk. And they keep saying so, that, you know, Lukashenko had the full right to do this. You know, firstly, they blamed Hamas for this bomb, for this, you know, kind of, which turned out to be false.
Which Hamas did not accept any responsibility for that.
Well, no explosive, no explosive was on the plane, and Hamas denied any kind of connection with this. And it's just, I mean, if it were not for people's lives and freedom, I would just think that I'm in a movie. Like all of a sudden, you know, Belarus blames Hamas for involvement, you know, with this bomb accusations. Yeah, so now, well, Lukashenko today spoke in front of the parliament and MPs, deputies, right? And he said that that the West is to blame because these was they were too aggressive towards Belarus and they should stop doing so. Now they're trying to, they basically, well, state media basically went silent about Roman Protasevich, about this guy who was detained. But now most radical ones are trying to pretend, trying to blame him, like trying to show that he, like he's a terrorist because he was on the KGB terrorist list, which is basically, you know, a politically motivated thing. Yeah, and they kind of tried to show him as, you know, kind of the one behind the protests, and so on. So yeah, so that's what's happening in the moment. A lot of
and Hanna, can I ask as well, just do you get perceived as being part of the opposition because you're critical, and what does that feel like for you?
At the moment, I mean, by who? By state media? At the moment, they call anyone, like they call everyone basically the opposition. So everyone who does not share their views and who is kind of brave enough to be critical or to kind of ask questions, raise questions about the regime's, you know, the doings. It's obviously, well, I am responsible of kind of, how to say, before my audience, right? Not for what the pro-government state media are saying. Journalism is not propaganda, obviously, but I think in this situation, when this is kind of black and white, you just need to obviously not report your views, but to report. Sorry.
Oh, no, Hannah's a very busy woman. That's absolutely fine.
Yeah, sorry. So you're not supposed to report your views, but the views of the people, of your heroes, of your characters, right? Those people who give you the information, and basically that's kind of the main difference for me, right? I'm not kind of say here what I think, but what people think.
Yeah, I'm going to get to some more of these questions in the chat box here. And I wanted to ask you, there's a question here asking, are women journalists particularly targeted? And I just wondered your take on that.
I mean, it's a little bit difficult to say in the Myanmar case, in that there aren't that many female journalists, to be honest. I mean, journalism is an incredibly male space in general, but especially in Myanmar, it is sort of very heavily skewed towards men, just by the numbers it does not seem like women are specifically being targeted in terms of sort of arrests. And what we're seeing in terms of the treatment of those who have been detained, we're seeing discrimination along other factors. Female protesters are definitely reporting a lot of sexual violence and things like that, but we haven't really heard as much about that in terms of female journalists. But we have one colleague who is Muslim, and when she was fasting for Ramadan, for example, they said that she was trying to incite a hunger strike and put her in solitary confinement because of that. And I think we do see discrimination against, or not discrimination, but sort of violence against female journalists, and the sort of the threats they receive. It tends to be much more sexualized. And sort of, I think women journalists are also much more likely to receive the sort of online harassment and the sort of the baseline of everyday violence, and the potential of that violence is much higher. But I think for now, in terms of sort of being targeted specifically for arrest or persecution, we don't have that much data to support it.
And Melissa, what's your take on that? Do you feel like women are kind of being targeted in a sense, or they're particularly targeted when they are raising these concerns in a way that men might not be?
Yeah, I mean, moving it beyond China, I think in general terms, and there's been research done on this, is that female journalists are targeted more than male journalists on social media. There's definitely a lot of misogyny. And part of it is just from random individuals, but I think that certain authoritarian states have also weaponized it. This kind of disinformation campaign is really hard to attribute, and that has been a struggle in the China story as well as the Russia story, and so on. I'm sure also Iran. To the best of our knowledge, and based on the experts that study disinformation campaigns in regards to China, it's a combination of genuine nationalists, but there are also sort of, they subcontract out sort of projects as well, sometimes to even places outside of China. I read about a case in Malaysia as well. And I think in those cases, you do see a lot of targeting of, at least when they do target female journalists, or not just female journalists, but activists, right? Anyone who says anything really critical about the state, there's a whole misogynistic streak to it for sure. I think it was something like 60% more. I mean, I'm just pulling this out of thin air in the sense that it does exist, but I can't remember the organization that studied it. If you want to Google search, Maria Ressa wrote about this in a Washington Post op-ed that came out on World Press Freedom Day, and cited the percentages and the results of that research showing that women are more targeted.
Rana, when you were speaking about your experience as well with the Iranian regime kind of targeting, it was family and kids, did it have a misogynistic kind of lens for you, or a sense that you're a woman and they're targeting you in this way?
They do. So they try to discredit you in every possible way. And in Iran's case, because it's a religious regime and there are many religious people inside the country, that's the angle they try to target you with. So for instance, on state media, they wrote articles about me not being married to my husband, just to show that, oh, she's morally corrupt and she's westernized, and they are trying to attack our traditions and our religious beliefs. Or for instance, they Photoshop.
I was about to angrily say, what's that got to do with you?
You can't be religious. No, you can't be.
Myself back.
You could be stoned to death if you have if you sleep with someone you're not married to. And obviously the online smear campaigns and the sexual threats, and they photoshopped my head on a Playboy cover, and I can't say my husband was displeased about that, but they can be very creative, which is partly about being woman, but in general they are very harsh towards journalists. So in our case, it's a religious society, so there's that angle as well.
I think it's really to look at how these states will kind of leverage the values that they say they're protecting in order to use it back against people who dissent against them. So I think in Myanmar you see something similar where like it's a culture in which respect of your elders, respect of your parents is really, really important. And we've had the regime call up the family members of journalists, of protesters, and try to pressure them to pressure their children. And so there was a really sort of funny but tragic case where the regime got the parents of a number of doctors who were protesting and on a general strike to scold them publicly to go back to work. And you have the regime, in other cases are much more tragic and not at all funny, taking the children, like a 2-year-old was taken because they couldn't find her father. And so, you see the sort of hypocrisy in the way that they simultaneously say, we're the only defenders of the nation, we're the defenders of the culture. If we don't exist, we will be swallowed by the West, or these foreign values, whatever. At the same time, they're the ones who are kind of violating these sort of things that are supposedly the sacred bonds of within the culture and within the country.
I agree with that. During my father's interrogations, they said that you have to stop her working for the BBC. And my father said, well, she's an adult woman. Even as a teenager, she never listened to me, and she's no longer a child. I can't tell her what to do. And they said, no, but she's your child. And as a father, you have the right to stop her. And then my father, he tried to use their own mentality and said that, you know what, she no longer belongs to me. She belongs to her husband, and this is his number. Maybe you need to speak to him because it's not going to work through me.
Because I'm not going to deal with that.
Exactly.
Fair
She's
enough.
too stubborn for me.
Absolutely. I wondered to all of you, we kind of touched on it just there, but some of the other dirty tricks and methods that sometimes these regimes use to undermine credibility. We touched on it just there, kind of calling family members and stuff like that. I wondered if you guys had any other examples. Melissa, do you have any examples?
Yeah, I mean, just to go into a little bit more detail. I mean, you asked what was the reason why I was expelled, and I said I don't know why. Regardless of that, I was told after I left for at least a couple of years that the Chinese Foreign Ministry, during meetings with other people, sometimes with foreign journalists or in different contexts, would bring me up as like a bad example of what and of what not to do. And again, it's all very vague in terms of what I actually did do. And I think that's one way of sending a warning to journalists. On China, this is a little less, this is not personal at all, I suppose, but there's another angle to going back to the title of the panel, right? Independent but not free, which is that they have quite a big structure in terms of state media and CGTN. And they do, like, for example, provide a lot of free news content, right? Just like AP or Reuters, they're competing with AP and Reuters in terms of providing video services, and they offer it free. Nothing comes for free, but if you're a small newsroom in a small country where the subscription rate for an annual subscription to AP or Reuters to use that footage is too much, you'll start leaning on that, and they've been doing that for quite a number of years. And I think these are the interesting ways that the Chinese state does things. They also have the money that, again, they have the money in a way that Belarus and Myanmar doesn't, right? To bring journalists, to foreign journalists overseas to China to do media training, right? And that often involves like their idea of the truth of China, which is like everyone is happy in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs are dancing. And we brought, we lifted 500 million people out of poverty, and these narratives, right? And telling journalists who, yeah, would love a free trip to China, and in newsrooms that are cash strapped all over the world, seeing it as an opportunity to essentially go on a junket. And I don't want to sort of judge journalists on that. Like, if you're smart, you can probably go on these trips with your eyes wide open and sort of read through the lines. But they do that, and I think that's an interesting aspect of China. We tend to look at the most the dumbest, sort of most ham-fisted way that they try to do this soft power diplomacy, like the Wolf Warrior, some stupid tweet like a Chinese diplomat made, or that a Chinese journalist from state media makes. But I think that when you look at it across all these different verticals, yeah, some of it is really clumsy, but there are also really sophisticated things going on as well. And we need to pay attention to that.
Yeah, definitely need to pay attention to those. And Hannah, I just wondered, what are some of the dirty tricks that you have seen recently that you have been aghast by?
Well, I mean, I'm not a NATO puppet, just so you know. So that's kind of their favorite accusation, I think, or allegation, because I write mostly in English, and I work for the Atlantic Council and for several media outlets, that are based abroad anyway. So there was this conversation, part of it focused on a gender component of harassment. So this is really prevalent in Belarus as well. We obviously received threats of rape and violence and even death threats. So this is done to kind of silence women and prevent them from speaking out. There was this sentence that I recently read, that women who talk too much need to get raped. So this is it's also this in Belarus as well. I was thinking why, because if we also see, I know we're running out of time, but if we also see kind of the number of political prisoners, journalists, many of them are women. Those journalists who were targeted, who were shot with rubber bullets, who were injured badly, they are women. And then, and this must be perhaps because, well, maybe security forces feel stronger when they detain women instead of, men, because maybe they are scared to detain men. That's why they kind of target women more. So kind of these are questions I've been asking myself, but at the same time, just to kind of finish it in a more positive way, I mean, women journalists are really strong in Belarus, and when those two female young reporters were behind in a metal cage, they were sentenced to 2 years in prison. They're my friends. When they heard their sentence, they were showing victory signs and kind of trying to encourage people who were in the courtroom. So so this shows that they kind of believe that they are right, that they haven't done anything bad, that those people who detained them, they are to blame, not them. And I think that's why they feel, a lot of strength.
I just thought of one really quickly, if I can, because you threw the question at me and I was trying to think of a dirty trick example.
Oh, no, it's fine. You go ahead.
I suddenly thought of it. A common one, you're paid by the CIA. Right? Like, we all get that. I was still waiting for my check, but and they do it to so many people. I've seen it. Martha Roldos, the investigative journalist in Ecuador, was really lambasted with all these accusations as well. And I'm sure, like, country by country, it's like a common thing.
Yeah, I think I'm actually paid by George Soros, not the CIA. And I'm also apparently half white, so that's very fun new information for me.
Was that news to you?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, the George Soros stuff was, not surprising. You kind of expect that to happen eventually. I think it's a little bit, I wasn't quite expecting it in Myanmar. I thought I would be getting paid by different people, considering that, there's a very small Jewish population in Myanmar, and it's, for me, surprising to see these sort of globalist anti-Semitism narratives that kind of penetrated even a place like Myanmar. But yeah, the sort of like implication of foreignness in one way or another was definitely not a surprise.
When you kind of read or hear this stuff about you, how does it make you feel? I know we sound like we're joking about it a lot, but I just wonder how you internalize it, and does it make you feel scared? Oh, sorry, that's going to end.
Oh, sorry. I think for me, it does hit a bit hard. I was born in Myanmar and grew up partially there, but I, was largely educated in the US, spent a lot of my kind of like very important like teen, like learning about yourself years in the US. And so to go back to Myanmar and be told from like every side, like literally every side, that, you're too foreign to understand what's happening and to talk about this. And there's nothing you can say or do or learn that would ever make what you're saying valid or even like potentially correct. I think it's quite difficult, especially when that feeds into the very narratives that are being perpetrated by these authoritarians, right? Like, I had my parents call me a blood traitor because I was working on Rohingya related stuff, right? Like, I already have like secret police occasionally coming to chat with me about who I just talked to. Like, I don't need my parents being like, why are you taking Western money to denigrate our country? So I think the dirty trick there is not just that these regimes are promoting this sort of mentality or the sort of narrative, but that they're getting this mentality to penetrate into just ordinary citizens to the point where, they don't see media and independent reporting as a vital, if sometimes, difficult to hear part of society that helps improve society and make sure that we have freedoms, but as like they see media as something that's either for us or against us.
And it goes to the
Rana,
weaponization.
what is it like being?
Oh, sorry.
Oh no, go Melissa, and then
just
go
really
Rana.
quickly, just going back, it goes into the weaponization of identity. I was saying at the very beginning. That's all.
And Rana, I just wondered what like the personal toll of this really, what it feels like to see someone write about you or you hear about it, because I think for journalists we're so used to writing about other things and things external, but I just wondered the personal toll.
Yeah, from outside, I used to think I was very strong and I could handle it, especially because I've kind of in the face of a campaign 2 years ago, the BBC decided to complain about the situation to the UN. So I have addressed the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And I thought I was handling it well and I was strong, but every time you walk back from it, especially because you're telling everybody's story, it's not just your own story. Every colleague who's lost a parent and hasn't been able to go back and has watched their parents dying in front of a monitor every time that somebody gets ill and you can't be there. And then because I've been telling their stories to the world, and I walk back and every time you feel shattered. And then every other month I have a panic attack or I collapse. But then I pick up my pieces and I put it together and we keep going.
It can be exhausting though. It sounds exhausting.
Yes, and also it's the nature of the stories you cover. It's not just the personal toll on personal level. The stories that we cover, and we have been covering for over a decade, of just like many of the other countries, the tragedies are just too much to handle. And for me, when it really hit me hard was in January 2020, when Iran shot down a passenger airplane and a Ukrainian airplane in which 176 people, including 20 children, died. And that was the moment that I just couldn't handle it. And I had a nervous breakdown. So on personal level, it's the pressure on family members, but on the other hand, it's the nature of the stories that we're constantly exposed to that it's very difficult to deal with.
both Hannah and Melissa, you can jump in because I can see you both really nodding. What's the personal toll that it has on you guys?
I mean, I always have this awareness of my privilege, right? I would feel bad and say, wow, I'm stressed out, but you know, covering this kind of depresses me, but it's not as depressing as the person I'm writing about. So I think we all struggle with that. And I've learned to respect my feelings and say that, you know, just because my life is better than others doesn't mean these feelings don't exist. So I keep that in mind when it comes to the stress. But I mean, I'm actually talking to you from Berlin, and there's a little bit of a choice. If you look at the stories I work on, I don't exclusively look at China's impact beyond its borders and studying techno-authoritarianism, which is a lot of the themes that I do look at. But I have chosen to be a freelancer that allows me to pivot to other topics. And I've really found that this has been a way for me to get the kind of balance and freedom. So this is yet another very depressing story, but last year, one of the big projects I did, really big projects, was looking at COVID in nursing homes in the United States. Not exactly the happiest topic, but it was like different from China. And so as a reporter, personally, this has worked for me. But again, it's been really hard to sort of build this kind of beat, and not everyone can do it. And I feel really, really grateful to have been able to. But that's how I've managed it. And just really quickly, I mean, I think I did this all subconsciously, and it's only recently that I realized that that's what has motivated me to cover all these disparate topics. I think this to sort of balance all the depressing things off of each other, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Hannah, I'll go to you, and then I'll give us all a time check, because my gosh, we have flown through a lot of questions, but we've only got 15 minutes left. So I'm going to kind of write down a couple of questions that I've seen pop into the inbox, but I just wanted to ask Hannah about the personal toll that it takes to do this very incredibly important work.
Well, I think it was mostly mentioned, so I can totally relate to what other speakers said. Yeah, I mean, I've been living through it still, so this has not stopped. There is no end to it yet. And I remember this moment when I I did not really have emotions when I was in Minsk. So I totally you had to work, you had to flee, you had to run from riot police. And then you just have to kind of work all the time, basically. This harassment, all of these kind of threats, which I've been receiving and my colleagues are receiving, it's important because there is little kind of recourse when it comes to what we can do with this, right? I'm in another country, and anyone going to, am I supposed to report this threats that I'm receiving? What should I do? This might not produce results, or I will not receive kind of any support or legal redress. Another issue is I feel lucky because there are people around me who are in the same situation, so we kind of can support ourselves and kind of share our views and you know what happened to us. It's definitely important not to ignore the abuse and not just turn off your computer and just forget about it, because you know these kind of digital threats might easily become physical threats, and again, there are grounds for us to think that those threats might become reality.
Yeah, Hannah, thank you so much for that. I just want to remind everyone that we've got roughly around 15 minutes left, and you guys have sent in some amazing questions that I'm going to try and get through now, and just a reminder that you're watching the Ethical Journalism Network's panel on independent but not free. Please put it in the chat, or please put it in the Q&A, and I promise I am looking and getting through as many as I can. And because we've only got a little while left, actually, I wanted to ask this brilliant question by Anna, which is actually one of the last questions I had here, and it was just about what keeps you all kind of fighting the good fight. And Anna has asked, hearing all the experiences you have lived, I wonder what motivates you. Like, what is that thing that motivates you all to continue reporting and covering all these topics? So yeah, I just want to ask you that, and I'll start with Rana.
A good question. I don't know. I don't know where it comes from. I don't have those. I mean, I used to when I was in my 20s, thinking that, oh, there's a mission and I can do something. As I grow up, and I'm losing hope, and I'm becoming more realistic about what journalists can do. Yes, I feel like I can be a voice for those who don't have a voice, and I can ask the right questions, and I am in a privileged position to work for the BBC, where I have more freedom than my colleagues who are based inside the country. So I will keep asking the right questions and try to be their voice. And then when I receive messages on social media after I challenge a regime supporter on my show, that's very heartwarming. And I can hear that people are pleased to see that I am asking those questions that they wish they could have asked. But I can't pinpoint the reason why I keep going. Yeah.
It's hard to think about, because it's just something that you just keep doing, isn't it? And what about you? What keeps you fighting every day?
Yeah, so this is something I have been thinking about, because I had actually thought I quit journalism. So right now, this is the third time I've left Myanmar. The first time was a refugee. The second time was because I did too much journalism and had to flee. And then again, too much journalism and had to flee. But yeah, I think it is a combination of an inability to help myself, a lack of a self-preservation instinct, probably due to mental illness, and like rage. I think, you know, I've always loved writing. My background is in anthropology. You know, I really like telling stories, and I think, you know, when it comes to things like when something like this is happening, yeah, like I can't really help myself, right? Like that first day of the coup, I had to decide, like, you know, am I still a retired journalist who will probably be fine if I don't say or do anything? Or do I go out and completely ruin the life I've been building for the last 2 years, or risk everything? Yeah, and you know, again, I have no self-preservation instinct. Like I don't want to be tortured, but I'm not that worried about dying, I guess. So I left because I don't want to be tortured, but yeah, I think, you know, I'm not that concerned about my safety on a day-to-day basis. And then I think I'm also driven often by like real anger and disappointment at the way in which countries like Myanmar often get covered. I remember a very early article about the coup, which by Politico, which had the headline of like an inconvenient test, an early like test of Biden's foreign policy. And I was just so enraged that the plight of 55 million people and like the destruction of the future that, you know, basically this whole country had been building was boiled down to such an influential audience as this sort of like fun little political test for a leader, half a world away. Yeah, so I think, you know, I do this in part because I feel like other people need to either be held to account, or at least we all need to work together to improve.
Yeah, definitely. I get that sense of when you can't help yourself. I am absolutely the same. Whenever I'm doing a doorstep to a politician that I just want to get an answer from, I have that same instinct. Even if doorstepping can actually be really quite scary, going up to someone in power and asking them questions and holding them to account is actually quite terrifying in a way, but I can't help myself. I want to do it. And because I'm in that position where I can, I have to, and I relish in that. So I hear what you're saying. Melissa, what about you? What keeps you what keeps you going? Why are you a journalist? I'm sure many people have told you, get out, get into banking, finance. Why do this?
Certainly my parents don't understand. I think it really resonates. It's very thoughtful, the comments so far. Like rage, we often think of rage as such a negative emotion, fear as a negative emotion, but they don't have to be. I guess a couple of things, right? I am fascinated with humans. We are very weird. So the human condition itself is something that I just can't help but keep wanting to figure out. You see so much good. I've met so many people who are so much better than I could ever be. And I've also met people who are, oh my, they're like, how? Like, I don't understand. You're just genuinely a bad, evil human being for doing what you do. So I think the interest in the human condition, but I also think going back to the rage and the fear, I'm reminded of maybe it's simplifying things a bit too much, but an article in the Atlantic quite a number of years ago about life, and that some people choose a life of happiness versus others choosing a life of meaning. And I think that the way they wrote it, it seemed like you had to pick one, and I guess that might not be fair, and plenty of research is probably done about that essay being too simplistic. But I think that in my mind, in my head, you know, what makes me get out of the bed every day is not feeling happy necessarily, but having meaning, and want to stay humble about it, right? Like Rana saying, like, what can I do? You know, when I was young, I thought I could change the world. I think it is important as a journalist, I remind myself, my one story, my one piece, my one thing is not going to change. But if we have a group of journalists, a group of media, and we are this echo of effect, and we compound it, that message, maybe something will change. And I think that's also what drives me.
Yeah, that really puts in my mind about COVID, and a lot of the in the UK with personal protective equipment. That was one of the big things at the beginning of the pandemic, and that was a collective, a lot of media all saying, look, this is going on, where's this protective equipment, where's the mask, what is going on? It was that collective build that eventually put pressure on, that eventually got answers and eventually got results. It doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it's really meaningful and it's really powerful, and it means something, and you feel like you've been a part of change. And so that's really important, I guess. And Hannah, what about you? What keeps you going?
The same thing, change. In February, I published this information about a kind of expensive deal between one company in Belarus and several banks in Europe, and this credit agency from Sweden that is going to insure this deal. Swedish journalists investigated the whole thing. They came to Belarus, they reported on that, and now the deal is being, so this insurance agency is kind of pulling out of the deal. That's one reason. Another reason, I remember my first story as a journalist, it was about women who worked at this plant in somewhere in Belarus, and they were not paid by their bosses, but their managers. And I reported about this, and other journalists reported about the same thing, the same situation. And then their situation, the women's situation, actually improved. And then that's when I understood that, you know, I have the power, like I can influence the situation, I can help. I can change something for kind of better, for good. It's a lot of responsibility, because this information that we provide as independent journalists, right? Because people in Belarus often don't have any other source of information, of reliable, trustworthy information. So we kind of supply them with this. It's a lot of responsibility, but it's also a great privilege. This understanding that kind of they need you, and you are responsible for what they know and how they perceive these facts, and whether they actually would get these facts. And I'm being extremely kind of paid back for this by the people. I remember there were moments in Minsk when police came and they wanted to arrest journalists, and people surrounded us, and they kind of saved us. They defended us from being detained, because people know that kind of they also need us, right? That we protect them in a way, like we share this information, the world knows about what's happening in Belarus, and the world reacts, and kind of it all, there is no black hole, right? And they often let us in apartments so that we are not detained on the streets. Just, they did know us, but they were like, well, come and, find the refuge here. And they share this information with me about what's happening inside, like on the ground, inside the country. They share videos, they share, facts, whatever. They are really kind of responsible citizens, eyewitnesses, and there is really nice collaboration between us. They trust me, and as a journalist. So it's really important. It's kind of it's challenging, really. It's a lot of responsibility. It's very kind of stressful, right? But it's also very pleasant, right? You feel the mission. You feel that you're doing something really important.
Yeah, definitely. We've only got a few minutes left, and just while I have you, and before I let you go, I just wanted to ask you just one thing that you have taken from this panel tonight, from your fellow panel members, one thing that you are going to take away that you kind of didn't know before, one thing that you would like to reflect on. And I will start with Melissa. Sorry, that was really unfair. I just looked at you, Melissa.
I mean, I'm really humbled. I don't know how I got on this panel, but I have to, and I'm thinking this now, I really do feel that this is one of the most important panels I feel like I've been on. I don't think I've had this kind of conversation on our panel. So I really thank the others for their thoughts. I will be thinking on that one thought, I think, is the concept of rage being not just a negative emotion, but a positive one.
And that rage comment came from you, eh? What about you? What's the one thing you're going to take away?
Oh, there's so many things I'm going to take away, I think. I think one thing that strikes me is the humility with which everyone here, I think, approaches journalism, and sort of what we're able to accomplish, and why we have the sort of, it's hard to say privilege when you're like being threatened all the time, but the
and
sort of
and having to leave your country.
Yeah, but like we have the ability to speak to the world, and we have the ability to at least think we're making a difference, and every once in a while we get evidence of that, right? In the case of these women getting paid. And yeah, I think what I'll be reflecting on is just how blessed we are to be able to do meaningful work, even if it's difficult at times.
And Hannah, what about you? What's the one thing you're going to take away from tonight's discussion and your fellow panelists?
Many things. Well, firstly, we are from completely different parts of the world, but we share so many similarities, and so many experiences, are the same. We can share the same stories. We are so vulnerable, but it's incredible how, at the same time, strong we are, and how dedicated we are to our profession. So it's been a pleasure, and I'm again proud to be a journalist, right? Because when you see other people sharing kind of the same admiration to this profession, and kind of the same values, it's great.
Yeah, it kind of renews, it fills your cup up a little bit. I feel like I've been refreshed and rejuvenated. And Rada, I'll have the last word from our panel.
First of all, it's amazing to be on a panel with such inspiring women. But I think for me, it's the most important thing is perspective, because sometimes you get so busy in your own world that you think that, oh, the situation is terrible in my country. And it's a good reminder that a lot of us are going through very difficult challenges, and quite similar, as we all heard. And it's just a reminder that we're not alone. We're all in this together, and the fight will carry on.
Indeed it will. What a rallying call to end on. Thank you very much to all my panelists, Rana, to A, I'm so sorry, I've done that all day, apologies for that, to Melissa and to Hannah, thank you so much. You've been watching the Ethical Journalism Network panel, and I believe we're going to have a link up in a couple of days. I believe that is the case. Thank you so much for watching, for taking part, panel, for being so honest and open. I feel like I have learned so much that I'm going to take away, so thank you all.